Hello, everyone. We could quiet down a little bit, please. I hope you've helped yourselves for a drink and you're comfortable. I would like to thank you all for being here today at our event in Agora. We have a bunch of students, tutors, and professionals on the same platform for an open discussion amongst themselves and with you, the audience, of course, about the sharing economy, notably Airbnb, and how this kind of dissipates our individual identities and collectively begins to shift our understanding of the urban realm. So are we destined to be homogeneous nomads? Only time will tell. You are all encouraged to interject. There will be floating microphones once the debate opens to the public. We will begin with short opinionated statements and introductions by the speakers. So please do raise your hand if you want to participate, and the microphone will be brought to you. So a big thank you for our panel for being here today, and I'll pass it now to Sahir, who will mediate the discussion.
Thank you, Jessica. So very big welcome to all of you, and yeah, I hope Pret doesn't sue us for the posters. Okay, so with a few clicks and a credit card, we now hail taxis through satellite and instant book private islands in faraway paradises. As the internet prompts a shift in the way we negotiate with our constructed environments, subsequently, it alters our social constructions and the nature of existence in the contemporary city. As our notions of public, private, temporary, permanent, generic, specific, are yet again challenged by indistinguishability, the home, once our own personal fortress of solitude, becomes a commodity traded online. How must we then begin to adjust ourselves in this transforming landscape where we arrive as a local and belong anywhere? We must recondition our archaic understanding of mobility and domesticity in an ever-increasing world of virtual sharing and its inherent archetype of nomadicity. We must update the way we have defined our relationships amongst ourselves and our possessions. Conceivably, interactions like these, whilst entailing personalized sophistication, make habitation seem flat and generic. Does a medium that facilitates these new forms of exchange free us or further entrap us? These online platforms make people micro-entrepreneurs of themselves, allowing them to tailor every aspect of their own lives in order to financialize it and maximize profit on it. This takes us away from the way we conventionally understand ownership and brings us into a brave, new, and cooperative world. Trying to grapple with this question here today, we have a fantastic panel of experts in the field, distinguished tutors and architects and students. And I would like to introduce David Greene. David is a founding member of Archigram along with Peter Cook. He was elected associate member of the RIBA and was the recipient of the RIBA Gold Medal in 2002. He's currently a visiting professor of architecture at Oxford Brookes University and an external examiner on the Masters in Advanced Research at the Bartlett, and teaches Diploma 7 here at the A along with Samantha Hardingham. David has made a career pursuing projects that seek to deepen contemporary architectural investigation of form and its relation to information technology and technology at large. We have Alex Stephany. Alex...
Can I correct? Actually, I'm not. I was, but
sorry,
I had nothing to profess. So, but thank you anyway.
I'm sure you have a lot that you'll bring to the table.
I'm happy to be called.
So we have Alex Stephany. Alex holds a first-class degree in English language and literature from Oxford University. He was the CEO of Just Park, the world's largest website for shared parking with over 300,000 customers. And under his 3-year leadership as CEO, Alex has helped grow revenue tenfold and pulled off the largest equity crowdfunding for a startup in history. Alex and his company, formerly known as Park at My House, have been featured by various news corporations, including CNBC, NPR, The Wired, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Evening Standard, etc., amongst others. He's a former management consultant and the author of the book, The Business of Sharing, a book about making it in the sharing economy. We have Dr. Harriet Harris, who currently co-directs Graph, a small interior design studio focused on using emergent neuroscientific intelligence to inform the functional and experimental efficacy of spaces in which we live, work, and learn. She's a prolific author and has won numerous awards, and she's now a senior tutor in interior design and architecture at the Royal College of Art in London. We have John Palmesino. John is a tutor in Diploma 4 and has also established Territorial Agency along with Anne-Sophie Rotskog, an independent organization that combines architecture, analysis, advocacy, and action for integrated spatial transformation of contemporary territories. They are research fellows at the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmith, and John also convenes the MA there. He has been the research advisor at Jan Wijk Academy in Maastricht and has previously led the research activities of ETH Zurich and Studio Basel. He's also the founding member of Multiplicity. We have Fabrizio Ballabio. He's here. He's an architect and an educator, of course. He graduated in Switzerland at the Academy of Architecture in Mendrisio and received his master's with distinction here at the AA. He now teaches as both a history and theory as well as a first-year tutor here. Fabrizio is a co-founder of Air. The rest of Air is here with Luis, Alessandro, and Octave. Air is a collective formerly known as the AirBnB Pavilion, and they're actually working on the British Pavilion in the Venice Biennale this year. And they are having an installation there. We have Ioana man, who's a third-year student here, and has worked with this subject extensively since her first year. And she recently published a Phoenix journal regarding the same. And we have Sofia Belenky. She's had a previous degree of fine arts from Bard College, and she studied at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation in Columbia University, and Bruce High Quality Foundation University before coming to the AA, where she's now a second-year student. So a big hand to our panel, please. So each person on the panel has approximately 4 minutes to orate their stance or position on the subject. And this will then be followed by an open floor debate where all of you, the members of the audience, will be free to raise your hand and ask a question and join the discussion. And thank you to all the speakers. I think we'll begin with David.
I thought you might say that was age before beauty, they say, Old English say. For a start, I'm sorry, I understand you're an expert in the sharing economy. I prefer that there are other descriptions, aren't they? On-demand economy and also the access economy. I don't think it's anything to do with sharing. But if I can, I'm sorry, you're going to have to indulge an old man here. My introduction to sharing came in about 1966, soon after the introduction of the birth control pill for women, which, of course, opened up a whole new meaning of the word sharing, you see, because now you could share things which you previously couldn't, or it was very dangerous to share. Anyway, I was coming back from college one day with somebody called James Data, who was involved on the editorial board of a magazine called A Futurist magazine. And he said, I want to ask you something, David. He said, I wonder if I could have sex with your wife. I mean, he put in a much cruder terms, actually, but for politeness' sake. And I said, well, you'd better ask her. You know, it's no use asking me. And he said, well, I am very clean. I've got a doctor's certificate, which I get every month, because in those days, sort of multiple sex was kind of what you had to do. anyway, I was quite shocked by it, and the next day I was working with somebody called Olivier Ferrari, who was actually the tutor of an AA tutor, Chris Pierce. I don't know whether he's probably not here, but anyway. And I said, that's very odd. He wanted to share my wife, and he actually offered that I could share his wife too, so we're doing this sharing. And he said, well, frankly, David, I wouldn't even like to share my toothbrush with somebody else. So when you come to sharing, I think what I'm trying to, in a roundabout way, it's a sort of what you're willing to share, and really Airbnb is a kind of, at its worst, is a kind of entrepreneurial system which allows people to make money. That's what it's about. Nobody's going to say, oh yes, come stay with me. Yes, it's not sharing, it's a new kind of economy. So the nomadic thing, yes, I know it did have a lot of purchase in the 60s, and of course probably it's going to, maybe this new technology allows a new meaning of that word, I don't know, but that's something I guess you'd have to explore in a project. Anyway, okay. I'm a little surprised that you haven't got any really young people. I think you should have had like a 13-year-old here, and certainly you need an anthropologist, because they're the people that are really, I think, trying to look into the new social relationships that the on-demand economy is beginning to propagate and set up. Okay.
Thank you, David. Harriet?
Okay, so, wife shagging nomads with good oral hygiene is quite a hard act to follow, but I've got some notes on my Airbnb views. So really, I wondered, and I'm more interested in posing questions often than telling people stories, is Airbnb really a gentrification device? Does it really dehome and displace people, or is it just a bit more comfortable and involving a bit less cat hair and drunken hookups than sofasurface.com used to involve? And in hosting, are we really renting our homes, sharing with hot desk-style flatmates, operating as complacent hoteliers, or is something more sinister taking place? In the UK, you've had years of Thatcherite legacies, which have brainwashed us into thinking that we can own a home, even our sense of entitlement to one is enshrined within human rights acts the world over. But we also are relenting in our expensive enthusiasm for customising our homes as a means to articulate some unspoken aspects of our personalities, tastes and education. So in a way, what does this mid-century modern Nugochi coffee table say about this man, his testicular propensities, or if it's a woman, her ovulation cycle, delete as appropriate? I suppose we've been quickly seduced by the monetisation of our domestic interiority, and privacy is apparently not priceless. We relinquish our idea of sanctuary, and even our safety becomes third-party property, which we even pay for through Airbnb service fees. I think effectively we're selling out on our own judgment, instinct, and our ability to trust others in doing this, but I suppose as long as you've got bagels in the freezer ready for when your guests arrive, so that makes it okay. Private space becomes public space. We're in effect pimping out our homes to bankroll our urban lifestyle junkie proclivities. And interiority ends up retreating into itself like layers on an onion skin, one very thin and very translucent layer at a time. For example, as a host, you might lock the bedroom door, you might even bother to wear pyjamas, or you might just run to the toilet at 3 o'clock in the morning naked and just slam the door. Airbnb is billed as a sharing economy, but I think this is neoliberalist nonsense. It sounds benevolent, it sounds affordable, and when, if you like, the sharing economy works well, it humanises us all. It demonetises and makes kindness as instead of a welfare provision, and it allows us to leverage underutilised resources. But I'm cynical. I think the Airbnb sharing economy is capitalism behind a kitten mask, and much like Uber operates below tax radars and undercuts paying hotels, and effectively monies and revenues generated that prop up welfare state and broader society issues. And anyway, what makes something ready to wear or ready to live in anyway? The immediacy of it, like some sort of hipster live project pop-up in a piss-stained alleyway, bankrolled by the RIBA Forgotten Spaces project? Or is it its disposability? We're disposing actually of our solitude. In fact, we create a kind of painful love addiction for it, a longing for this elusive state, imagining it to be so much more delicious and intense than real intimacy with others. And what does it matter if we rent on Airbnb, on Gumtree, My Spare Room, via an interest-only bank mortgage, or by living with a not-quite hook-up but nice friend we found out on Tinder? We never switch off our phones at night anyway, those beautiful, lickable nipple substitutes, warm metal pressed against our faces, and when someone texts, tweets, or tags us in a photo, likes something we like or emails us, we think we discern a heartbeat in our wet nurse. Alone, the world offers itself freely to us. If we share it with others, we're unmasked, we're naked. We surrender our choices like children do to adults. But back to the thesis. The word Pret might mean ready, but its etymology from preter means to lend and not to own. An Airbnb is neither version. It isn't ready, because even with Instant Book, there's nothing immediate about clawing at a key box in the dark in a strange country, after on average 14 different email and text communications with your host and the Airbnb reservation reminder robot. And it isn't alone either. If Airbnb is a barometer on our domestic future, what does it really tell us about the changes in the way we regard our most intimate, non-bodily boundary, our home? What does it tell us about our illusions about distributed pop-up and open source share spaces? And are we really willing to get naked in front of strangers just so long as there's somewhere that we can charge our mobile phone?
Thank you so much. I think, Alex, if you can respond to that.
Sure. I feel probably the odd one out on this table, if not in the entire room.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. There's quite a lot more of you than me, so as long as this doesn't kind of end up in some sort of lynch, you'll hopefully be fine. But out of interest, how many people in the room have started a business or run a business at the moment? Let's have a quick show of hands. Okay, so very, very few people. And I think because of that, I want to dispel a misconception, a couple of misconceptions. I think the first is that entrepreneurs are all rich people. I think probably we all know this, but we spend so much time reading about Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg that it's quite easy to forget it. And the second misconception is that people become entrepreneurs to get rich. Again, that's just not the case. It's not the case for me, and it's not the case for, I think, every single entrepreneur that I know. People become entrepreneurs because they want to solve problems and they want to create value. Now, people differ at times as to whether they are solving problems or whether they are creating value. But that's why I ended up leaving a reasonably well-paid job in corporate law that was very solid to do something that was highly risky and highly uncertain. Not because I wanted to become the next Mark Zuckerberg in terms of wealth, but because I wanted to create a lot of value. And in that sense, I suppose I'm sitting on a different side of the fence, because I feel that you can do both those things at once. You can make a lot of money and create a lot of value. You might not do both those things at once, but quite often, the value you are creating is reflected in some form or another in some sort of financial monetary value. People will pay for something because it adds value to their life. And so the sharing economy does a couple of things that interest me very much. The first is it's creating many new opportunities for people to make money and to save money. Now, the first claim to fame for most of these sharing economy companies is that they are cheaper than the alternatives. Now, we can talk in abstractions about whether Airbnb is alienating, but the fact is that for hundreds of thousands of people every day, it provides more space, an authentic space, for less than that space would cost in a hotel. That is adding real value to people's lives. It's putting money back into their pockets. It's also, of course, making money for the entrepreneurial homeowners. But the reason why I think it's particularly interesting is that it's not purely about the money that is made and saved through those efficiencies. It's also about the social capital that's being created. Now, last year I had 2 trips to Berlin, and they were very, very different experiences. On the first trip, I stayed in a Marriott hotel. It was very expensive, and it was actually rather miserable, rather sort of alienating. I walked into this huge empty space that was pretty much, devoid of all humanity. and it cost me an awful lot of money, and it was really a very dehumanizing experience. On the other trip, I stayed with an elderly lady who I got to know, who told me about Berlin, who recommended some places to go to, and that was a lovely experience as well as being an awful lot cheaper. So I think the sharing economy is interesting because you get the social capital and the economic capital coming together. Now, I don't have an axe to grind. When I joined Park at My House, which is this peer-to-peer parking marketplace that lets people rent out their driveways for other people, I hadn't even heard of the sharing economy. But what happened was, a couple of years later, I was approached by a publisher, Macmillan. They said, hey, write a book on the sharing economy. Go out there and tell us an insider's view on the sharing economy. And so, not knowing very much, I set out and I basically tried to determine whether this was hot stuff or hot air. And what I concluded was that it's 80% good and 20% bad. You can always pick holes in things. There are always losers. But most people are winning most of the time with the sharing economy. And I think in the context of this actual discussion, what I think is the key point that I'll leave you with is that disownership can be a very, very beautiful thing. There's a term that I come up with in my book called the Goldilocks complex. You'll all probably know the story of Goldilocks. Can you remember what happens? The bears return to their home and they find Goldilocks there. And they're angry. Who's been eating my porridge? Who's been sitting in my chair? Someone's been lying in my bed. The Goldilocks complex is possessive ownership. The Goldilocks complex is, that's my stuff. Get your hands off it. I think it's an inherently unhealthy and negative emotion. And I think what's happening now is that it's actually being eroded away. Centuries ago, people were saying that possessions were a source of stress, a source of anxiety. Boethius said that. More recently, Bertrand Russell was saying that. But these guys were aristocrats. Those guys were rich. They had everything. They were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. Now, hundreds of millions of people are being able to liberate themselves from the weight, from the stress of possessive ownership. And I think that's a very wonderful thing that the sharing economy can do.
I'm sorry, do we have to call it the sharing economy? Look, if I want to share this beer with you, I don't say you can have half of it, but you've got to give me a couple of quid. Do you? I don't see why you can't use it.
I'm not going to disagree with you as much as you might think or might even like. So I think the sharing economy is a really awkward term. I think it's really been a victim of its own.
Sharing's a really nice concept, isn't it? I share with you something. I don't ask you for money. You've concentrated on the sort of sharing as a financial transaction.
I think it's a very, very imperfect term, for exactly the reasons that you give. But I will also point out that there are some aspects of it that are shared. You are often on an Airbnb sharing your home. If you're using a peer-to-peer car rental platform, you are sharing your car. And I think perhaps most interestingly of all, these are shared communal experiences that people are having. That experience I had with that very elderly German woman was a shared experience. It was a united experience. Now, money may have been passing hands at the same time, but that didn't stop that shared communal experience.
John, I'd let you respond to Alex.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to welcome again all the students, current and former, and possibly also future, to this group. I would like to address two different notions. The first one is the notion of the free laborer. Can you hear? The first one is the notion of free labor, which is at the very heart of the discussions of enhancing or countering the liberal or capitalist economy that we share. The second notion is that of transcendence. And you see where I try to go by setting out these two notions. The first idea, the first condition is that in a capitalist economy, what you do is that you freely dispose of what you want. such as your work, such as your home, such as my beer, my glass of wine, whatever I want to get rid of, I can bargain for and I can get a price for. That's at the very heart of the notion of capitalism. I am free to choose what I will get rid of, including my time as laborer. The entire antagonisms around capitalism arise from the fact that we see that the free labor is not that free. We might want to contain that idea of freedom and understand that actually you're not free to choose what you want to get rid of. You're not free to even choose what you want to work on. And actually freedom is so limited by the conditions of who appropriates the means of production and the results of those production. And the entire history of, let's say, the left and the right is an antagonism about free labor. You can go from Marx all the way to Margaret Thatcher. What is at stake is the idea that I am still myself in spite of having given away other things. What will remain is myself. Now the question that I want to pose is one of transcendence. And it has to do with a condition of not being able to dispose of and not being able to choose what I'm going to get rid of. And it used to be that when we discuss economical conditions, we discuss worldly matters, matter of fact. It was really a materialist idea. You remember those times? No, you're too young. You materialists are only interested in the economy. What is interesting is that the discussion today, as I see it developing, is not one of material conditions, but on the contrary, it's one of transcendence. It's one of conditions that are completely detached from the very material elements that we might want to get rid of. And this is really the condition of the, what I must say, I really appreciate David's position. We should not call it sharing economy because we're not sharing. We are imposed on a situation where we think that we might dispose of certain elements, still maintaining our subjectivity. But what is really interesting is that the very conditions that are today at stake is no longer the independence of your subjectivity, of yourself from what you're disposing. What you're trying to do is to augment your social capital. And I'm very happy that you brought up this condition. What you're really showing us is that the neoliberal condition from within is not an entrepreneurial condition. I'm very happy to see that you are aware that not many entrepreneurs exist in the world, because that's not how the economy operates. The economy, on the contrary, operates by augmenting your human or social capital. So you have to attract investments to go to a prestigious school like this one, or you have to have inherited certain traits, or you have to have done certain things. My point today is that if we want to understand the spatial architectural implications of building homes, we might have to address the fact that stuff has become transient. Stuff has become transcendental. And I would argue that one of the knowledges, such as architecture, that tries always to bring back the transcendental to material, practical conditions, is an urgent knowledge to develop vis-a-vis conditions like the sharing, so-called sharing economy. Thank you.
Fabrizio?
So, yeah, I would love to make an opening statement, but my participation here without any ethical reproach is under certain terms and conditions, so I might as well read them. August 2015, AirBnB Inc. and AirBnB Ireland Limited, care of Lewis Silkin LLP, 5 Chancery Lane, London, EC4A1BL, Dear sirs, infringement of the intellectual property rights of Airbnb, all defined terms in this letter of undertakings bear the meaning given to them in these undertakings or Lewis Silkin LLP's letter of 12th of May 2015 or the Airbnb terms of service. These undertakings will become legally binding between Airbnb Inc., Airbnb Ireland Limited, and Airbnb Pavilion as defined below, on signature by Airbnb Inc., Airbnb Ireland Limited on one part, and Airbnb Pavilion on the other part. Although headed without prejudice save as to costs and subject to contract, once signed by the parties, these undertakings will become an open document and binding on the parties. In consideration of Airbnb Inc. and Airbnb Ireland Limited agreeing not to issue legal proceedings against us, Airbnb Pavilion, Octave Perrault, Fabrizio Ballabio, Alessandro Bava, Luis Ortega Govela, together Airbnb Pavilion, in respect of the complaints in Lewis Silkin's LLP's letter of 12th of May 2015, and without prejudice to their right to take action against us for any future infringements, we hereby undertake, whether acting by ourselves, partners, principals, agents, or any of them, or otherwise howsoever, by midnight on 31st of August 2015, to cease and desist of all use of any trademarks, logos, slogans, or commercial indicators of origin of Airbnb, including but not limited to those annexed to these undertakings, or any similar marks, including but not limited to AYRBNB and or AYRBRB, including any use as our organization's trading name in our website or social media domain names on any website or any social media platforms or email addresses in relation to any of our exhibitions, events, gatherings, or otherwise in relation to any of our activities or services and or any related materials. To remove or procure the removal of any collective content as defined in the Airbnb terms of services or image or text in respect of which you, i.e. Airbnb Inc. or Airbnb Ireland Limited or any of your group companies owns or licenses the copyright from any website or any social media platforms under our control and cease of all use of any such images or text, whether online, media, or otherwise. To destroy or deliver up to Lewis Silkin LLP any and all material that would be in breach of the undertaking at paragraph 1 above. At our cost and expense, to transfer or procure the transfer of the ownership of the domain name www.airbnbpavilion.com to Airbnb Inc. or their nominated representatives within 21 days of the date of these undertakings. And in the interim, any website access of the domain name will carry the following message only. This website is not connected to or endorsed by Airbnb Inc. or any other Airbnb group or company or affiliate. Please visit our new website at www. To cease and desist from making any misrepresentation or causing, enabling, or assisting others to misrepresent our activities, goods, or services as being associated with or endorsed by Airbnb Inc. and or Airbnb Ireland Limited or any of our group companies. To cease and desist from visiting the site, from using the site, application, or collective content having the meaning assigned to these terms in the Airbnb terms of service, including but not limited to renting out spaces through Airbnb for commercial purposes and holding public events in there. To comply with Airbnb terms of service in all material respect, and to confirm to Lewis Silkin in writing that we have complied with paragraphs 1 to 5 above. Notwithstanding the foregoing, for a period of 6 months only from the date of last signature of these undertakings, we, the undersigned Airbnb Pavilion, shall retain the right in future media on our new website to refer to Airbnb Pavilion as a previous art project installed, operated, curated by us, and to link to historic press articles and other historic communications about the Airbnb Pavilion art project, provided always that any such reference to Airbnb Pavilion will include a statement directly alongside it, no less prominent than the reference to Airbnb Pavilion itself, making it clear that the previous art project was not and is not connected to or endorsed by Airbnb Inc. or any other Airbnb group company or affiliate, and provided always that such statement is not an adverse comment about or statement derogatory of the Airbnb brand or any Airbnb group company or affiliate, or calculated to damage the Airbnb brand or reputation of any Airbnb group, company, or affiliate. For the avoidance of doubt, Airbnb Pavilion acknowledged and agreed that any use after the date of the signature of these undertakings of the statement on the Airbnb Pavilion website as 20th of August 2015, formerly known as Airbnb Pavilion, identity is changing because of legal pressure, close quote, or any similar statement will be in breach of this undertaking. We understand that the above concession is a goodwill gesture on the part of Airbnb Group, and that Airbnb Inc. Ireland Limited reserve the right to issue proceeding against us if we continue to refer to Airbnb Pavilion and/or to link to historic press articles or other historic communications about the Airbnb Pavilion art project after the period of 6 months from the date of last signature of these undertakings has passed. We, whether acting by ourselves, partners, principal agents, or any of them, or otherwise howsoever, hereby agree to bound the undertakings in this letter. The Airbnb word, mark, and bello logo, or any similar mark, except for the main specified in paragraph above. Yours faithfully, Alessandro, Fabrizio, Luis, and Octave. I want to also specify that I am a daily user of the sharing economy and have nothing whatsoever against it.
Also, we have really bad lawyers. We signed that. Can you provide a bit of context?
Sorry?
Can you provide a bit of context?
Can we have the panel and then we come back to this?
Okay.
Sofia?
The house is the object of our labor. The largest portion of the paycheck goes towards one's rent, mortgage, and utilities. In order to sustain this drive for property and the promise it holds, there's been a somewhat paradoxical shift towards generating income by partitioning the same space for rent. The property I once saw as a private stakeholder is now subdivided in order to maximize the square footage of my space and to generate income. Perpetual re-renting and subdividing existing apartment spaces made possible by Airbnb and companies like it has had a dramatic impact on how we understand familiar relationships as well. The family is now multiple strangers sharing a home. It was once initially designed for the nuclear family. All extra space partitioned off as private bedrooms, increasing capacity for rental income. The income generated from the home far exceeds the income of its tenant salaries. Individual entrepreneurs rent homes in order to sublet them on Airbnb as secondary income. In order to pay my rent in London, I have held onto my apartment in New York City and rented on Airbnb, usually each month. On one hand, Airbnb provides a method for making my individual rent more manageable, while on the other hand, increasingly contributes to the affordable housing crisis. As cities become more expensive, jobs less predictable, ownership no longer seems like a future promise. Instead, domestic space has become partitioned, packaged, and rented as efficiently and as often as possible. One can no longer leave the office because the office follows them home and into bed on their cell phones. Smart is equated with work or jobs. One's pattern and preferences become the most valuable asset in the home. Sold off as data, convenience is traded for surveillance. Given that data is the new frontier, it's not surprising that Airbnb is investing in applications that will turn our home further into the data collection factory. Many applications now offer programs in tandem with Airbnb, house cleaners that connect to your Airbnb calendar to clean before your next guest arrives, a fridge that alerts you when your basics are low, smart locks that open for only approved guests. The data provides not only a commodity that can be sold to other companies, but also insight into how Airbnb can better adapt itself to the market. The company's free of charge photography service works alongside their drive towards data collection. The photographs allow them to manifest and assess their data collection into physical space. With this service, they not only sell the illusion of live like a local, but also a discernment of what will sell. The correct wide-angle view, lighting, resolution can double your profit on the site. Amenities, specific window views, all have values attached. Airbnb currently uses a platform called Aerosolve that tracks web history data. As our searches, clicks, and even eye movements are tracked, perhaps we're not far from an Airbnb that calibrates desires, watches our Amazon wish lists, recent Pinterest saves, and our Tinder preferences. A process already in place with Facebook using software such as AdRoll and Umbel. Most recently, Airbnb has purchased a company called Lapka, which creates devices that look sort of like trendy jewelry and monitor your home and body. The home of the week has become commodified to a shopping list, personalized and produced to our likes, sponsored by commercial breaks, and we rent it gladly for the low cost of our privacy. The so-called sharing economy is not sharing. It is instead providing free labor to companies that in return profit and own valuable information from us.
Thank you for that, Ioana.
So I guess I will go back to some of the things you guys have said, specifically to the parts where we might talk about Airbnb to describe phenomena that mark a shift towards the sharing economy and mark the situation that we're in, rather than triggering them or rather than being the sole trigger for the situation. Airbnb, of course, can be linked to new behaviors in the city, often problematic situations, but it is rather a marker for much broader changes. We should not forget that it was founded by people who were already living as roommates and were using couch surfing. So mainly Airbnb should be seen as a way of monetize the situations that these people were already in and situations that people who are Airbnb hosts usually are in. I have rented my flat out on Airbnb several times, while at the same time being sort of renting the flat I live in now. So Airbnb and most, in my opinion, capital-based sharing economy or on-demand economy platforms are usually used to rely on a person's owning either temporarily or permanently a space or an object, and are usually aimed at increasing their income rather than being a job as labor-based on-demand platforms might be, such as Uber. So talking about Airbnb as a reality in London, I believe that it very much responds and reflects behaviors that already exist in the city and that have existed pre-Airbnb anyways, such as the normalizations of having roommates, and generally having less expectations when it comes to both living and traveling, because when one person is already sharing their bathroom with two semi-strangers and is flying Ryanair, why wouldn't you be okay with using someone else's toothpaste?
Thank you. There's two major issues that have come out. I mean, yes, corporations are extremely efficient, and yes, this kind of system works in a ruthlessly efficient way. But at the same time, how do we imagine identity, right? How do we imagine the value of the things we own? Because in a sense, what we own becomes a mere economic value, which is interchangeable and disposable. Like we see when we put our homes up and our beds up on a platform such as this. Alex, would you have something to say?
I mean, I think there's probably a tendency to overestimate some of these changes, especially around personal space. I mean, these things have fluctuated throughout history, and I don't think it's necessarily the case that we are crammed into small, subdivided rooms, lorded over by avaricious landlords. That sounds a little bit like London in 1880 to me.
That sounds actually like most 19 to 25-year-olds who can't even afford to get on the property ladder in this city.
But okay, well, if you went back to Whitechapel in the 1880s, okay, you would find people.
I can also go back to Whitechapel now.
And let me finish. Let me finish. You could go back to Whitechapel in 1880, and there would be a system there called 3 relay that people would use, because 3 people would share one bed, and they'd lie in it for 8 hours each. That was what happened in 1880, a few miles up the road. So to say that suddenly things have been moving in this sort of linear fashion towards overcrowding, and that this is something.
No one's saying that though. No one's suggesting it's linear. They're identifying the fact that what's happening right now is some kind of warning bell on where we might be headed as a society and the implications for the affordability of homes. And I'm going to just introduce David again to this conversation because I think we need to just hit this sharing word on the head. It's like fresh frozen, right? It's an oxymoron. Sharing economy brings sharing, which is supposed to be free and generous and not involve money.
Yeah.
It monetizes it. And so whereas previously, I'm an Airbnb host, an Airbnb user, if I have family coming, I have to block out my room so that they can use it because otherwise it's rentable, right? So I'm not sharing, technically, I'm paying my mortgage. I don't do it because I love having strangers cooking really weird food in my kitchen and leaving their pubic hair all over my bathroom. I do it because I'm trying to pay my mortgage, right? So I think let's really not romanticize the whole sharing economy thing. What needs to happen is some really deep analysis of the distinctions between good sharing and bad sharing. And I think, Airbnb, the jury's out on whether it's really an idealized model of good sharing if we're going to talk about it, sharing economy, in a really blanket and open way. I think it's reasonable to suggest there's a calibration exercise that's overdue on the whole sharing economy concept.
I don't disagree with you as much as you think I probably do. I mean, one of the things I said about 5 minutes ago is that the sharing economy is a very imperfect term.
Well, no, I don't think you disagree. I'm just really excited.
Okay.
It's fine.
It plainly is. Okay. You know, to most people, sharing is about joint ownership of things. If I stay in someone's Airbnb, I don't jointly own that. So it is a very imperfect term. I think that what you have in the sharing economy is both the creation and the destruction of social capital, as you're talking about. You know, I mentioned before that people from very diverse backgrounds of different ethnicities and religions and cultures are brought together. And that's often a very, very wonderful thing, actually. It's easy to be quite cynical about some of these things, but that is happening. Roughly 800,000 people, okay, are staying tonight in an Airbnb. Now, there will be a very, very tiny number of adverse incidents that are actually happening. They will make the newspapers, or a significant proportion of them will make the newspapers. But that's actually pretty astonishing, I think, that almost 1 million people are cohabiting, and these are strangers. Now, I don't think we should let that fact get away from us.
Could I correct your figures? And I'm sorry to interrupt. The number of people that are sharing a roof as we speak is exceeding millions. What we are discussing, as far as I remember, we are in March 2016. We are at the beginning of the spring that is going to be again seeing around 13 million people on the move only from one single country. From one single country, Syria, not within that country. If you add to that the neighboring countries and the neighboring to the neighboring countries, what we see is that humanity is on the move. And I think that if we are discussing here tonight a condition like which is indicative or somehow marking, as our friend Ioana says, an ongoing transformation is not to address a will to progress or understanding of real facts, but it's really out of a concern. And I hope that you understand that when you set out yourself as being opposed to this group, what you were trying to do is to oppose yourself to a group of young designers that are going to shape the very environment that you and your families and in the future are going to inhabit. What is at stake is how are we going to shape that space that we are going to inhabit. It's not whether certain practices, certain economies are valid or not. It's obvious that if you meet someone who's got an interesting background and you spend some time with her, you will have a delightful experience and you'll have maybe a new friendship. But that is not what is at stake here tonight. What is at stake here tonight is what is the architecture, what is the condition through which we establish a shared space, not a shared economy, because the shared economy is the economy of shareholders. A shared space for humanity on the move in 2016, which includes, unfortunately, far more than a few thousand that are lucky enough to log into Airbnb.
The world in which you describe, the world in which you describe, where millions of people are on the move, sometimes because they're the victims of terrible circumstances, or sometimes happier stories, and they're an upwardly mobile, labour force. In this brave new world of mobility, surely we need more flexible ways of possessing and renting and occupying property. That is why Airbnb is successful. Again, one of the points I started out by making, people are not being forced to give this company money. They're giving this company money because it is creating value in their lives at that point.
I quote you, it's a liberation.
I'd like to say that...
Well, I think he's right. It is a tool, isn't it? Airbnb is a tool at the end of the day, and it doesn't. I mean, if we forget the sharing, the awful sharing word, it does liberate space in a new kind of way. Whether it, I mean, I think you're right. It does in train of that, as the technology catches up with it, it has some bad effects and it has some good effects. But your question about what a potential architectural consequences, that's also an interesting question, but then we'd be here a long time. And of course, that's a question for all of these young people, isn't it? What are the consequences of this on urban planning or housing or whatever? And you can argue that has the technology that enables Airbnb, has it liberated, it's enabled a lot of these population movements to take place, hasn't it? Otherwise they wouldn't. So it's both liberating and it's both a friend and an enemy at the same time, like everything in life, I suppose. Or not.
I'm just going to return to architecture.
I'd like to say that the debate is open to the floor. So if anyone wants to say something, ask a question, please raise your hands whenever. That's Alex.
So I'm going to consciously steer it back to architecture. Get a wink there. So in the book I wrote called The Business of Sharing, which I promise will be the last plug, I interviewed a venture capitalist called Fred Wilson. And he talked about, I think, the very interesting scenario that all of us know, where you have a block of flats or a large divided house, and you have some people on Airbnb, and you have other people not on Airbnb. You have the majority not on Airbnb. And the people not on Airbnb are very fed up of people that they don't know coming and going all hours of the day and night. And right now we're in this state of flux. The person using the Airbnb gets value, the person renting out the Airbnb gets value, but the neighbor just has downside risk. And so I think how we resolve this is going to be pretty interesting, and I think it's something that a lot of the people in this room are probably going to end up working on. I think you will have developments that are for people that effectively contract in to a kind of buy-to-share type model. There's someone that says, I've got capital, I can get more yield off it by having a very high throughput of tenants, which is effectively the economic trick that Airbnb does. And I'm going to probably pay a premium, maybe pay more to lend the money to buy a block, to buy an apartment in a buy-to-share building. Anyway, the venture capitalist that I interviewed says that the solution to this is the blockchain, or something that is metaphorical of the blockchain. I don't know how many of you are sort of approximately with how it works, but when you are transacting Bitcoin, you have every single transaction transparently visible on something called the blockchain. And what this venture capitalist Fred Wilson says is that this is the answer: radical transparency. And everyone in the future, to get over this, is just going to have to be very open with their neighbors, and either opt in or opt out. Quite how we get there is, I think, a more complex problem that you very smart people are going to have to work out.
I think there's a question there.
I mean, it's more of a comment. I think we need to go, I think for the purpose of the conversation, I think we need to go more to the kind of straight to the point. And I feel like what we should think of Airbnb is more like a product and also a tool of gentrification. And I think that's the way that we should frame it. Because it both allows for this gentrification to happen, but it also allows for us to basically, by the value that we're raising of the area that we're in, we also need to start kind of getting more money to be able to stay there. So somehow it's both this thing, and I think that's the way to tackle it. Maybe that's the answer also, to go from its origin somehow.
Is your comment a problem inherent with capitalism rather than something that it facilitates, right?
But yeah, I think it has to do a lot with the comfort that we're trying to basically, or getting used to be living in, and like that comfort that comes from like living in these areas where like Airbnb is most present, which is usually gentrified areas. So I think maybe the question should be posed around that, rather than like going for how we can make it functional in the future.
But I don't think that's even true that Airbnb is operative in centralized areas. Actually, the old model of hotels, those are all in the central, typically quite expensive parts of cities. And the interesting thing about Airbnb is it's actually incredibly decentralized, and that you can look and you could stay in an Airbnb in zone 4 or in the middle of, and many people are, and it's actually...
It's a gentrified, not central, right?
Yeah, but these are not necessarily wealthy areas, whereas hotels typically are much more prime real estate. Airbnb is unquestionably taking money to pockets of cities that saw no money from visitors in the past. I think that's hard to argue.
I know, but the prices are still calibrated around the affluence of the area, so it's still subjected to the same capitalist infrastructure that determines rent.
Of course there's massive inequality, but is Airbnb reflective of that, or is Airbnb the cause of that?
Can I just say, Airbnb is just one example, isn't it, of the effect of information, all of those corny words, data technology, on the way social arrangements of societies being rearranged. And of course, one of the effects that comes from mass immigration. You can now live in London and communicate home perfectly adequately on Skype. And one of the things it's doing is that somebody mentioned it the other day at an AA staff that, that Airbnb is the biggest hotel chain in the world and it doesn't own a single building. And the Uber is the biggest car rental company in the world, and it doesn't own a single vehicle. So the technology has a strange effect of evaporating certain aspects of culture and replacing it with others. And so I think maybe we're only here to discuss Airbnb. I don't know.
No, not really.
But I would have thought the wider discussion is about the impact of or potential consequences of those new technologies particularly on the city, I imagine.
So you just said that Airbnb is the world's biggest hotelier and doesn't own any rooms, and Uber is the world's biggest taxi company and doesn't own any taxis. Now, I'll put it to you that those are very good things. Okay, a couple of reasons why.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
Yeah, so maybe I'll address it to the room then.
Yes.
So, because that is economically efficient. The way that economies grow sustainably is by doing more with less. And everyone in the room benefits from that. And the other thing I would say, and I'm going to make another assumption, probably not only there are not many entrepreneurs in the room, there's probably not many investment bankers either.
Whoa. I don't know about entrepreneurs. I'm not sure about that. These guys are right
okay,
now
so there's
the slavery master's food chain of architectural qualification. It's
yeah.
incredibly challenging when you're gunning for a part 2 or a part 1 to think about being entrepreneurial. They're pretty much a modern form of slavery incumbent sector of youth society, in my view, because that's what, in a way, qualification system is about. Try to set up a practice outside of being RIBA qualified, not ARB approved, and you're liable, you can't get insurance, the RIBA don't want to talk to you, you're exposed in ways that are much worse than running to the bathroom 3 a.m. naked with an Airbnb guest. So I think don't underestimate these guys in terms of entrepreneurship. At the moment, we give them a very narrow bandwidth to communicate entrepreneurialism, and that's a portfolio. Beyond that, it's incredibly hard for them to express that. So, I think for me, I just want to have, now I've got the mic for a second, I just think, my earlier point around what are the spatial implications of things like Airbnb, to me, it's not sharing, it's just subletting glorified and made cuddly and cute, okay? It's still capitalism at its finest. It's not sharing, it's not generosity and kind-spiritedness and open-heartedness and just giving something with no hope of any reciprocity. It has a spatial implication because our ideas of what privacy are and our sense of ownership and sense of self are being basically sold off layer by layer. And if that's fine, that's great. But it has a spatial implication for what architects may be doing 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. What is it we're actually going to be designing if there's nothing that anyone really owns? There's no need to make anything bespoke because everything that's customized is wrapped around our wrist in a tiny device or impregnated us in some way. I don't mean to be a terrible futurist dystopian, but I thought I'd come here tonight and I'm hoping somebody from the floor get really excited and interrupt me. We were here to talk about the implications for architecture, not generically have this love-in about Airbnb. I know you love it, we totally get that, and that is fine, but I really want us to get excited about what potentially are the problems here.
Well, you're a customer, you said, and a host.
Absolutely, I do.
So you should,
need the money.
so you should stop using it on principle.
No, not at all.
May I interrupt this?
Wait a second. I don't dress up my participation in Airbnb as an act of generosity.
If I was a vegetarian, I wouldn't have a steak from time to time.
No. Listen, I think it's totally fine for me to participate in Airbnb because I don't dress up my participation in Airbnb as part of being a sharing person. I am sharing in other ways. This is not sharing. This is just capitalism. This is just paying my bills. My dog walker needs to be paid. I have a house plant. I need to water. That kind of stuff.
As are millions of other users.
We need to de-romanticize Airbnb as some benevolent gesture. That's all I'm suggesting.
I was making a point about macroeconomics before you spoke before, so I don't think it's a particularly fluffy and romantic view. What I was saying was that one of the reasons we got into such a mess with the financial crisis was that we were massively over-leveraged with very expensive assets, the key one of which was property. And actually the ability to access property without huge amounts of debt is very, very good for the global economy. I think making a bogeyman out of Airbnb, because there's huge inequality globally between the rich and the poor, which is a very, very bad thing, and I would not defend it in any way, is still rather, rather absurd. The reasons why there...
No one's creating a bogeyman. We're saying there needs to be an adjustment between good sharing and authentic sharing and monetized sharing. There needs to be a clear distinction, and there is a spatial implication for designers and also for just people who are involved in the system 5, 10, 20 years from now.
I really appreciate what you're saying, Alex. And if I understand the debate now is more or less, in my understanding, maybe I got it wrong, and I apologize for that. The debate is whether we should contain the phenomenon and reduce its negative impact, or whether we should try to have a different organization. The containment is both in positive and negative terms. In negative terms, reduce containment is ameliorate, make it, give it a shape, give it a form, make it work. And I understand you are on the positive containment and you're more on the negative containment side.
You've been listening.
My point would be this, that, and I go back to the fact that I appreciate what you're bringing in to the table. If we are to consider a macroeconomical condition, it means that we will be able to somehow draw a line around the agents of that economy. Usually, that line is drawn at the level of a nation. And then you organize that macroeconomical condition through an architecture, which is the architecture of the nation, by leveraging the economy by basically disposing of debt. More or less debt on the national or on the private level in order to achieve the highest level of employment. That is macroeconomics in a nutshell. I'm sorry that many of the students get bored immediately by this, but what it actually means is that what is at stake is employment. What is at stake is a form of free labor, where you will still be yourself, in spite of you being unemployed or employed or idle or very active, and be able to dispose. What I would want to bring back is instead a condition that is radically modifying the conditions of our bordering ourselves in a nation, which is the fact that we are the conditions through which we are starting operating our economic activities are no longer based on scarcity of the means of production. The conditions that you are indicating means, no, I have a driveway, I can start, everybody can start entering this so-called market. But what is most interesting is that once you get rid of the notion of scarcity in establishing the boundaries, the thresholds, the architecture of our shared life, which is, in the modern terms, that of the nation, you start seeing that what might be at stake is something so much more radical than we thought. Suddenly, you understand that what is at stake is not you being entrepreneurial in order to achieve a maximization of what was scarce through enterprise or through sharing or through linking or through working. But on the contrary is a situation where that which you are trying to maximize is yourself. What you're trying to maximize is your social capital, your human capital, the appreciation of yourself and your extensive self through the attachments of your flat or your car or your... what you're trying to show is that people won't act in order to maximize what is scarce, but in order to augment what is in excess. That is your ego. And so to understand that what we're dealing with is a transition from an macroeconomics of scarcity into an economics of excess is, I think, fundamental if you really consider the fact that we don't have another planet to modernize.
Can I try to put that in simpler terms? I will try. So I think this is very interesting in relation to the analogy of the blockchain you were addressing before. Because essentially the blockchain is a mechanism which works in relation to Bitcoin currencies, as far as I understand, as a form of validation process, right? So it is a mechanism which is in place to, in a sense, decrease risk, if I'm correct, right? I think that's super interesting in relation to, and I talk about sharing economy more broadly here, in relation to the idea of feedback, which, let's say, is becoming, for whoever is, let's say, a digital native, or whoever uses online media platforms, but also services, is a hegemonic and very important instance, no? The way in which you are rated as a user of a website, independently of what website that is. And the way in which you're using, let's say, if we trace the relationship between feedback and let's say reality, there is a very interesting, I think, mechanisms at play in terms of understanding, let's say, the way in which one's identity is formed around the reality one constructs around him or herself. So I think that's kind of an interesting point. On the other hand, I think in a nutshell, what John was trying to say is that, let's say, here we have a shift, or a very let's say a very important shift, particularly with the sharing economy, between, let's say, or there is a very difficult thing to grasp within the sharing economy, which is the difference between, or the relationship between optimization as a goal and redundancy as a result. And I think redundancy is actually an extremely interesting spatial condition, and it is very problematic for the reasons Lewis was pointing out before. But typologically, it is, let's say, if we deal with the question, let's say, outside of a critical framework, typologically, it is a very interesting question to address.
I'd like to interject there. We've got quite a few questions from the audience.
Just sort of taking the conversation back a little bit. I don't think the commodification of property, like in terms of Airbnb, such as any different from the commodification of any service, such as Uber or whatever. I mean, we have Uber now even in Lagos in Nigeria. The commodification of dating apps like Tinder or Grindr or whatever, like the commodification of sex to a certain extent, it's an ease of convenience. It's still cheaper, or it's still more affordable to rent an Airbnb with one or two people than, say, to go to a hotel. Say you were on a unit trip, we rent Airbnbs. It's still more. There's added value for the user because it's more convenient. It's cheaper to get an Uber than it is to take a taxi in the middle of the night at 4 a.m. when you're trying to get home. It's this ease or commodification is, I think, a reflection more of this digital age of convenience as opposed to like a specific phenomenon, which is Airbnb itself. I don't think Airbnb stands out or is...
John,
could I, I'm sorry, really, I'm becoming almost speaking too much. I think that there's a big difference in a notion of commodification in modernist terms, where things become materials, and what is happening or is about to happen and we are transiting towards, which is, I would say, the opposite. We're not commodifying, we're not making these conditions material, but we are making them transcendental. We're making them the opposite. And what is at stake for me as an architect is to see whether the knowledge that is architecture can somehow reterritorialize what has been made transcendental. That is, to make connections back to things, and in order to relink us to things and stuff, rather than deterritorialize and make our passions and our affects part of financial exchange. And what I think is, I go back to my initial statement, what we have to consider is the contemporary link between transcendence and free labor. That transcendence is the key word here. What is interesting is that it's immaterial. And at the same time, at the same age, the world is becoming more and more active. The earth, the very materiality of it, the immanent condition, is what is at stake. I think that I would reject the idea that this, say, digital or contemporary or neoliberal economy is commodifying. On the contrary, it's making things immaterial.
Well, Sofia has a point, and we have a question there after that.
Well, I agree that I don't think Airbnb is the only company doing this, but I think there's a danger in allowing our homes, our private spaces, into the hands of the corporations and being tracked, and the way in which the home, the view and the image of the home has become an object or has a value attached to it, where I think it also relates to the way we design as well, where a certain render is more appealing to the client and can sell for more, and suddenly the client agrees to it because it's rendered at this specific angle with these materials. And I think that's the redundancy, and the fact that these corporations that we're allowing into our homes, we're allowing into our homes with specific legal consequences and binding terms, like Fabrizio pointed out, where this is a company we're dealing with, not just as saying friendly.
It's consumable. It's not. I mean, it's not even like a new premise for design. It's using existing typologies and shifting them to an adaptable use.
But it will probably affect the way we design in the future. Will we have more private bedrooms because you need to have 6 bedrooms now that can be locked from the inside? Or will you have more windows? Or will you have multiple doorways for different entrances into the home? Things like this have the potential to...
No, in fact, it actually exists. And at a recent home fair in the US, several models for homes were presented which were actively marketed as homes with the rooms or suites to rent out. They were, in fact, reusing the plans of homes which were aimed at different generations, but they were sold on this premise that you have the self-contained flat which you can rent out on Airbnb. They were even in some briefs mentioning the name of the platform. And then to go, sort of going a bit back at what you were saying, I think there's a bit, in terms of the design consequences, there's a bit of a difference that we should make between platforms like Airbnb, which, going back to the stuff that I was trying to hint at before, which are based on capital and on being in the possession of something that you are using to make more money, and platforms like Uber, where you're relying mainly on your ability to work, which, I mean, cater at there's different people using them, there's different amounts of money being made out of it, but that's another conversation probably.
At the same time, I think there's a sort of feedback loop and a dialectic between how social relationships, like institutions such as marriage, are constructed as related to how spaces facilitating having an Airbnb guest in your home kind of relate, right? They both inform each other in a way. And how do we kind of then look at those relationships critically, in a sense, right? Because the project you just mentioned, they probably have had a stance on what kind of family or individual they want to house.
Yes, it's difficult to say that there's a strong theoretical background behind it, because it was basically a house fair. So there was not a specific argument behind it, but the audience it was marketed at was very clearly defined, and the way they were talking about it. So I think the urgency of designing or of considering these things into design is very much obvious and should be present. And I was thinking, in a way, I was hoping that was something that would appear more in this conversation, but maybe.
I think we have a question there.
Yeah, I have a couple of points to point out. To elaborate on what they were saying, it actually has begun to change the business of real estate, where now real estate owners and all these entrepreneurs are going and bidding at larger prices, making home owning for normal people even more of a dream, because they are buying and purchasing this land for higher prices. And also this increasing need for storing data in data farms has also shifted from selling land in kilometers to kilowatts because of how much energy this certain area is using up. So it's actually changing completely the way that not only we design, but also the business aspect. And also a point to you, Alex, as an entrepreneur, I'm not reacting to what you were saying as a customer or as a consumer, or maybe that you are an entrepreneur and you were speaking a certain way and sort of romanticizing everything, but you were saying that you as an entrepreneur or entrepreneurs, it's a misconception that you guys are in the business just to make money and that you guys are trying to add value into people's lives. But I don't think audience maybe bought what you were selling, because you failed to mention the people whose lives you actually devalue with businesses like AirBnB, because, for example, the New York Home Association has published so many figures on the amount of people who have lost jobs in the hotel businesses, and even in some cases people have been forced into hosting their own homes just to be able to pay their mortgages because they've lost their jobs because of Airbnb, which is kind of fueling this fire of this sharing economy, which isn't really sharing anything at all. If anything, it's just taking away from one person, giving it more to, giving it back to another. Capitalism with a different name, if anything.
I mean, you're unquestionably right. Of course, people lose their jobs because of structural changes in economies. Of course. And they do now, and they have done for centuries, and they will do centuries down the line. It happens. But for me, it's less a case that... Can I finish a point? It would be... No, go for it. Go for it.
I think Alex finish your point.
But for me, it's actually it's less about, is it a glass half full or a glass half empty?
So maybe you can romanticize it as much and just say that the glass is always full, and you can always...
Well, look, I've come to a debate to, try and express some difference of opinion. Hopefully, that's a good thing in a debate. But it's not necessarily about whether something is in a binary fashion good or bad. Structural changes always do lead to job losses. But structural changes in economies are actually necessary for that economy to grow and develop. It is actually necessary. And so when you have these structural changes, they are what I would say is sort of 80% good, 20% bad. And it's terribly unfortunate for people that can't adapt their careers or lose out economically. But
I agree that in order for someone to lose, but for you to say that a significant amount of people, like you're justifying the amounts of people that are losing their jobs because of this. I mean, Airbnb makes ridiculous amounts of money.
It's a loss-making money. It's a loss-making business.
No, I think we can't blame the corporations for I think it's for all the problems we have. The problems we have are inherent to an economic system. And
we're going to continue to talk about money this evening. So everybody in this room is rich. We're all rich. So let's give a break to the money. The AA is supposed to be about ideas, about speculation on the possibilities of what things might be, how we might make things better, how we might alter things for the better, not to continually harp on how we're going to make 10 quid out of our renting out our toilet to some passing penniless archigrammer or something.
There is already join a platform called AirBnB.
I like you two because you're talking about the same things from a different point of view, which I think is really good later. But to me, I think I'm completely out on my own here. The issue is about technology, and the other question is you talk about efficiency and economic efficiency. When is Airbnb going to get hold of the AA? When is this technology going to transform the AA from some sort of moribund institution that charges you a huge amount of money so they can have a lot of expensive land estate and employ a lot of expensive, well, actually very cheap tutors like myself. And I was thinking about sharing. I don't know, there's what, 8 of us here? Imagine if it was 8 Richard Rogers, it would be costing about, £3,500 an hour. So when do I invoice you, or are we sharing here?
I'm allowed now? All right.
Sorry.
No, I just wanted to say...
It's just this money thing that's driving me mad. I know we're all rich, but the pursuit of ideas, you can't... If you're going to say... If you're going to just think constantly, how much am I going to earn, then you're not going to get anywhere, I assure you. I can promise you that.
Well, it's a privileged view that don't have to think about money all the time, I guess, right?
I do think about money all the time, yeah.
But I think your point was interesting about value, because there's an illusion, actually, that Airbnb is creating value. In my view, it's transferring value away from homes or hotels, and other bespoke industries dedicated to providing those kind of rentals and taking it more into the private realm. Now, on some levels, that could be valid, and I can see arguments for it, but I can also see arguments against. But we need to, again, I'm not trying to be negative, I'm trying to present a critical view here. So I think a debate surely is about having a range of perspectives, and I'm just trying to occupy a particular territory so we have some criticality about Airbnb as a subscriber to Airbnb. But I think this notion that entrepreneurship is all about wealth generation is a little bit of an illusion. Often it's about taking wealth from something else and under-resourcing another industry. And to just sit back and say, oh, it's structural changes, to use a direct quote, that concerns me, because we shouldn't feel so passive about what's going on. We shouldn't mystify it as something, like that we can't possibly understand as people who have a profound understanding of structures. We shouldn't make it something that is obscure to us and inaccessible to understand as just a series of very basic financial mechanisms. And that was all I wanted to say. Thank you for letting me say it.
There's a question there.
Me? Okay, so I'm just going to tackle this very formally, because I think that's what it's not been missing tonight. Today is Airbnb. Tomorrow it's going to be multiple companies doing the same thing. Today we're sharing our homes. Tomorrow we'll be sharing our clothes, probably. So
that already happens, right? You know you can do that already.
Really?
Just saying, yeah. Can't you tell? Right?
But anyways, one of the biggest thing is, like, once there was an architectural element called the facade, which there was a boundary between the public and private space. And today, that's nothing. Like, facade does nothing, because we have an Airbnb and we can log in and see the interior views of most of the houses around this block. So the facade doesn't do the job that it's supposed to do. That's one of the things I want to mention. And the other thing is, I think what is missing is services that Airbnb provides. One is the instant booking. The second one is the photographers. The reason Airbnb is making money is because they introduce photographers and how they frame this, constructing this dream of sharing economy. And I'm pretty sure everyone around this room had a shitty Airbnb experience once in their life. So Airbnb is actually not the way they romanticize this idea of sharing economy or not. And as an architect, which probably going to be tackling this in 5 years, how we're going to resolve this formally more than just theoretically talking about it. That's it.
I want to ask a question. Do you think having a crucifix hung on a wall within your house makes your space public or private? I think this idea of corporate encroachment via the internet is a bit of a mystification somehow, and I also feel for Alex, who's here actually taking all the blames for no reason whatsoever. because these are, let's say, this, I guess it's embedded in a process which is much broader, which has to do with probably, I think regulation, if you want, and let's say policies is really what we should be talking about here, because if any of this is happening, entrepreneurs are not to blame for the opportunities they take, but it's probably who is to blame are the councils who represent us, or who, let's say, make the rules in such a way that certain things can happen, which is basically us.
Alessandro?
I just wanted to bring to the table a term, which is disruption, which is for me like the only link between entrepreneurial culture and startup culture and architecture, and also it's a problem mistake with things like Airbnb, because the problem with Airbnb for me, and I'm not interested at all in the economics of it, is that like every startup project, I'm going to call it, it disrupts in the beginning something that, an outdated model. But then the problem, what is happening now is that it has disrupted so much that it has gotten to a point where it's structurally changing the way our cities work. So that is the main problem for me, and that is the problem for architects and for people who regulate this, because to make it more, let's say, into a trivial point. I mean, I think everyone is saying that they use Airbnb, but it seems that, I mean, it doesn't really sound like it, because actually, if you go on Airbnb, like, I don't know what the percentage is, but most people now like rent a house, and then they rent a house, let's say, with 2 rooms, and they rent it to completely, offset the cost of their rent on the second room, or they buy property exclusively to Airbnb it. So that is the problem. That is for me the crux of the thing for like architects and urban planners, that the meaning of cities, especially metropolis, is completely changing, because now like places like New York or Berlin or whatever, in the center, when you have like the center of the city, which is where people tend to stay if they're traveling for business or for leisure, it's like empty. Like Manhattan is like the biggest case, or like the case that I'm more familiar with, and you can check. I mean, there is websites where you can check actually statistics about this. Is that like most of the properties that are rented in Manhattan nowadays are used to let's say make money on Airbnb. So it basically like the entire notion of what a city is as an economic structure, as a social structure, is changing. And the problem is that nowadays we have no means to control corporations and the extent to which they disrupt. So that is kind of, and I think that has a parallel with architecture, because and in that sense I think, that's why I think a lot of architects and young architects are fascinated with this, is because, architects also disrupt in very similar ways, and also in very, in ways that I would say are as negative as some of the disruption produced by startup culture.
Yeah. I think that the idea that there's no agency is very interesting, because there's no sense of being able to touch, of having something that is within your reach. And I'm really interested in the fact that it's something that I hear more and more by your generation, which is the generation post the Berlin Wall, as if you are completely devoid of capacity of acting on the world, which I think I find puzzling. This, on one side, participating and collaborating in the establishment of a new form of sociality, and at the same time claiming that there's no capacity of acting on the world. I'm really puzzled.
When was it saying that?
You just said a few sentences ago that there's no capacity of acting and containing. But that's just a footnote. I wanted to go back to the fact that many times we heard romanticizing. And Romanticism is a phenomenal challenge to the very kind of disruptions, to use your word, that were put in place by capitalism in the late 18th century, early 19th century. The challenge was romanticism. That means that it's not important now to defer your pleasure, but because in the deferral of the pleasure, in capitalist terms, what will happen is that you simply will die. Nature is here now, and it comes at you, and agency of nature is far larger, and you can only partake in it. So it's not about deferral, it's about romanticism was a phenomenal challenge, very similar conditions as the ones that we're describing here, exactly because it went at the core of what was at stake and said, we're not challenging this from the outside, but from within. What will be at stake is no longer simply saying that, you cannot enjoy life, but you have to enjoy it here and now, because otherwise you'll be dead. And suddenly you start understanding the role of romantic literature in establishing complete different conditions for political action. And the outset of that is the formation of nations in the 19th century. What I wanted to say is that maybe we should romanticize even more. And I think that we should be far more careful in understanding the logics of symbolic gestures in addressing concepts like the ones that we're discussing here. And I'm very happy that students are setting up such a discussion, because I think that it's important to understand that it's not going to be easy to understand the logics of these situations in all its implications. You need really a lot of work, a lot of learning. It's going to be a long event.
We have a couple of questions. We're going to end soon, so can we have some points back and forth quickly? And that would be really great. The first one there.
I just wanted to ask, is this now the end of place? Is it being replaced by a transit selfie suburb? Question. Does place become space architecturally?
First of all, I just wanted to mention that I'm sorry that
David has to. David wants to respond to that.
Yes, good question.
Yeah.
But it's a good question for these young people, these young designers at the AA.
I think, let's have all the questions now, like hanging in the air, like briefs for you guys when you go out there. You go away and you sample shit in your portfolios. Seriously, it'd be amazing.
I'm so sorry that AirBnB took such a hit tonight for that, but because I think it's just.
I was just saying I had half an hour.
I just think it's just a tool. It's just a tool available in the capitalism, and that we're free to actually choose to use it or not. And the genuine. Transcendence was suggested a few times. Romanticism as well. I think we're all capable without being, to not be alienated by any services that we use, and we need to compile anything in the capitalism to actually reach and go through the path that we want. Well, what I mean is that sharing, for instance, is something that is much more, it's about empathy, that if it means something to us, then we're not really sharing, because we want actually that social capital. We want to maximize the self. When you actually transcend yourself, then you don't actually relate and you don't need the result of whatever you're sharing. Then is there a self-empathy, a self-sufficiency about empathy? Can we actually move forward from that? And does sharing take place only afterwards? I'm not sure if I have a strong point right now, but I just don't want this conversation to be alienated by just a service or a startup or something that is actually interesting. And I
think it's the same question as the previous.
We have a question here.
Got one over there.
I think we have one here first.
Hello. I was wondering, with the topic of the material becoming transcendent, what John would think the physical architectural implications be of material or of the house becoming transcendent?
Okay. Do I have to answer now, or do we answer?
I think
or we take all
you
the
respond to that, and then we get another one.
They're questions for students.
Yeah, I don't think that I have that answer. I think that my job in this particular project that I'm doing, that is within the AA, is not to give the answer, but is to really ask you to ask that question, and I'm very happy that you asked it.
We have a question. Yeah, we have another one here.
So I'm really happy that people are talking about these platforms and these technologies and trying to fight to find a connection with architecture. Basically, I think there's one way to approach the question a bit more in abstract terms, like to link it really precisely through the idea of platforms and protocols. They are somehow both, like all these technologies they facilitate certain relationships to people, to things, and also to access to information, which is basically what architecture has been doing forever. And I think it's really, like when you start thinking about it somehow as if maybe these platforms and these protocols are somehow a weird evolution of like a science that architecture has developed, a knowledge that architecture has developed. It's a nice way to answer the topic. And maybe one way of, perhaps to pick up on two terms that you mentioned, which are decentralization and transparency, which I feel are associated always with a lot of hope. And for like transparency, for example, I think it's about seeing, and all the things, it's about who has the control of the gaze. And I think it's always a very, it's something that architects have always questioned. Hiding, what do you hide, what do you show, who has access to that a certain place, like very simple things. And then about decentralization, which I think maybe architecture has less talked about, or perhaps less directly, but maybe to think, I am always worried about this link between decentralization and equality. Somehow it always means the same thing, but actually, since these platforms are about facilitating, or giving you ways to put yourself on the market or your things or whatever, if you have more, you put more on it. So basically, it's about polarization, and I think. And decentralization is about polarization, and I think that's something that seems maybe antagonistic at the beginning, but I think that's really the true nature of it. There's books actually, on it. It's not my idea, of course not. So I also, and maybe to finish on the protocol thing, is that these protocols are making you, facilitating you, giving you ways to put stuff on the market. But, they could also maybe have some redistribution embedded in the code, for example. So, for example, as soon as there's too much polarization, they would redistribute or something like this. Just to give a very basic example of questions of redistribution of wealth that the state has been taking care of, for ages. There's a lot of history about that. And, and I think it's not because you have a platform that basically have many nodes, one per individual, that everybody's going to be equal. It's not really a question, I guess. It's maybe I want it to be at this table.
I think one of the ways that these companies like Airbnb and others might themselves be disrupted is through what I call cooperatives 2.0. So actually imagine an Airbnb that was owned by the hosts. I think you're going to be seeing, maybe in the decades to come, phenomena like that. You could have businesses that are crowdfunded at Just Park, the company I was running. In about 3 weeks, we raised money from 3,000 individual shareholders. So this is how far transaction costs have fallen with some of these very liquid platforms in the internet. And so I think that would be an interesting way that actually there could be greater democratization of these platforms, and whether it will happen or not, we'll have to wait and see, I suppose. I think just one quick point I'll add on transparency. It's obviously a very complex subject. I think we've discussed some of the negative points around transparency and data and the intrusion of corporates, and I think those are all very, very real concerns. I think there's some very interesting implications of the extent to which all of us put our private lives online. Especially, you know, I don't know what the average age or the median age of people in this room would be, but I suspect that a lot of people in the room might have a slightly different attitude to privacy than people in their 30s and 40s and older. And I think in the future, I think of it like this. In the future, all of our deeds, whether they are good or whether they are bad deeds, will follow us around, like school reports. And anyone can read this school report. Now think about that. Think about everything you do, good or bad, being online. And whether that is itself good or bad, I think it's too big and complex a question to answer. But there will be some people that love that because they will see the behavior improves, and there will be others that feel threatened by that transparency. I happen to think that the net result will actually be a very positive thing.
We have a point here, and that's the last point for tonight, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I wanted just to propose a twist in the reasoning. No one asked what we are not willing to share. So, for example, Airbnb doesn't want to share their brand. Ultimately, we don't want to share our identity. Nobody wants his Facebook account cloned or something like that. So that means that what I'm trying to say is that from the discussion, it seems like the idea itself of ownership shifted somehow. Right? That's what kind of emerged. So I'm wondering if I can imagine a world where this reasoning goes the whole way through, how long it will take before I can live in London and change my bedroom anytime, or having a kitchen, whatever I need to, and I will pay automatically with my phone or whatever. And, the question is, shall I be free to have that option?
I mean, but I would like to answer, but the very point of you thinking that you will be free to have that option is something that rose through the liberal society. And what we're discussing here is a completely different set of values. That condition of you being identified with what you can dispose of is no longer tenable in these kind of conditions. And maybe the conditions that we are describing here might alert us to the fact that we don't have so many concepts of property as we ought to. We tend to, as was pointed out at the very beginning by Alex, to identify property only as appropriation. That means as an exclusive use. But there's so many different ways of understanding property. Yeah? What you have and what is proper can be part of shared conditions, like farmers share a tractor, which I think is what we're discussing here tonight. Shared economies, farmers sharing. I'm from Piemonte, no? There's la cantina sociale. I think that's what we're discussing here. No? You share the certain means of production. But then there's also other forms of property, which are very different from that. And we're lucky enough that people dedicate their lives to study these things. And I would highly recommend the work of a fantastic scholar, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Economy, Elinor Ostrom. And she really dedicated a lot of efforts in understanding the multiple notions of property around things and how to govern those things. And her alert was to always multiply the institutions through which we operate notions of property.
Just had a really quick question to ask, but in terms of, for example, especially with, again, going back to Airbnb a bit and sharing the home and the house and the frequency of users who are using it, doesn't it, in a sense, erode the idea of community? Because in a sense, like if we go back to some places in the 1980s, you know, the sense of community was still strong and stronger. And when frequency gets involved in changing of users and ownership, what happens to the community? Does it, I mean, obviously it transforms and changes, but does it still exist in a sense?
I think we have another question there. And
Hello. It's not really a question, but it's just a response to the question about community and how that changes and if it still remains, if possible. And I just wanted to liken the situation to a youth hostel or a travel hostel. And it's usually quite a nice kind of atmosphere in it where you have a constant change of people. And it's just a different form of community where you accept the changing personalities that you meet. I guess it's a very different situation because everyone's on holiday, but I just wanted to compare it to that.
I think that's a great point to end on. I think, sorry, I think that's all we have time for, unfortunately. And again, the conversation will continue upstairs in the bar if the panel isn't too tired. And once again, a big hand for our panel. Thank you so much for coming. And also, we have that's our last event for this term, and hopefully we have some interesting stuff lined up in the next term. So keep in touch and be connected online. Thank you.